Just a really minor point. I don't know if you remember, but in the Phaedo, right before he dies, at the very end, escaping immortality. I thought that was brilliant what he said about Plato, but Socrates' disciples ask, shall we wash your corpse? Or shall we wash you? And he says, if you can catch me, meaning I'm gone, you can do what you want with my corpse. But this, if you can catch me, is quite a nice confirmation of this.
Of course. I mean, actually that's very interesting because, as you know, I mean, in Greek thinking, I mean, the soul is manifests itself in the moment of separation or detachment. And in order to ensure that moment of separation, the corpse has to be treated properly. I mean, this is the problem in the Iliad. Because when Hector is killed by Achilles, and then Hector takes the corpse and drags it around, the outrage is precisely that the soul cannot be fully recognized as separate. And the individual Achilles cannot be fully recognized. And then when Priam then goes and asks for mercy to Achilles and recuperates the corpse, then it's only at that moment that there is separation. So in the Phaedo, precisely, again, the genius of that little remark is, my soul has already been separated before the consecration of that separation. If one thinks of the soul as precisely that which survives the consecrated body in separation, which is a kind of metaphysical conception of immortality, which is the theory of immortality of the Phaedo. So that's the idea that the eternity of Socrates refuses the very theory of immortality, as well as the immortalization of Socrates in Platonism. And that's why, in a sense, in the Phaedo, there is this double absence. Or it's not that there's the absence of Plato, which, as you know, Plato specifically calls attention to the fact and says, I am not there. Which, of course, is complicated because you could ask, well, isn't to say I'm not there to say I am there? And the other moment is precisely this sense that I am already gone before I can be gone, so to speak. Because in a sense, I was never there. I mean, just to play with that language. So that's the way is to think about the notion of eternity without a traditional metaphysical conception of immortality. And that it's going back to Plato to sort of, and Socrates to try to get at this conception of eternity, which has been suspended and neutralized, if you wish.
It's hard for me not to think of it as totally, in terms of, it seems like the orientation towards eternity importantly happens in the refusal of an immortality. Is that right? And,
yes.
And so it seems like an incredibly, I don't want to say just negative, but a very empty temporal. I mean, I don't know how to approach it.
Well, I mean, so. There are at least, let's say, there are different ways in which you can track different conceptions of immortality, as opposed to what I will call eternity. And in Patočka, I think you can map this on to Gilgamesh, Odysseus, and Achilles. Because those are the three great epics prior to the origin of philosophy. And if we had more time, which we don't, we would have to really read the Republic because, as you remember, how does the Republic end? It ends with the myth of and the question of the afterlife of the immortal souls. And who is one of the souls in the myth of is Odysseus, who again repeats the choice of returning in the lottery. So there's a kind of complicated discussion about authentic eternity as opposed to immortality. But for Patočka, I think in one sense there's a kind of great clarity that there's two conceptions of immortality, or there's the immortality of the gods. The immortality of the gods are beings who are not burdened by work, who enjoy an existence without end. That is denied human beings, but we aspire to that insofar that we suffer from our own work. So in a sense, it's a kind of false transcendence. It's kind of mysticism to want to be a god in that sense, to want to alleviate ourselves of our human condition by becoming something which is inhuman, which is precisely what Gilgamesh learns despite himself, because he doesn't refuse it, it is refused to him. That is the wisdom of the serpent. Then there is the immortality of men, which perhaps for Patočka is in its most virulent form with modernity. So precisely the affirmation of the self, of subjectivity as the center, and that affirmation then produces politically different systems which are fundamentally about the attempt to realize something like immortality. Now, not at the level of the individual, but at the level of the structure. So it is a system that completely perpetuates itself without any capacity to be fundamentally ruptured. And this is exactly what Francesco was mentioning, that what's interesting about Patočka is that the modern decadence is a decadence that survives and perpetuates itself. So it's an immortality. It is the total mobilization from which we cannot break out of. And part of that's then tied to a conception of sacrifice, that the highest conception of sacrifice is to sacrifice ourselves for the greater whole, for the nation, etc., etc. So that, in a sense, replicates the mythic structure of the natural world, where death, in a sense, is not purely individualized. That is what I will call the death of death. Because death always has a meaning which is inscribed within a totality. So that's the politics of death, which fundamentally, in a sense, comes to fruition with the Great War. That's another false conception of immortality for Patočka. And so he wants to understand eternity in a kind of, a very different sense than these two conceptions of mortality, as well as, and that's what's interesting, it's not the immortality of our end, which is the structure of the great deeds, of narratives, which then are retold, etc. In a sense, it's really contemplative in a kind of traditional vocabulary.
It reminds me a lot of the gateway of the moment in Nietzsche, and the greatest weight in the thought experiment. In terms of being very difficult and only kind of carried out in the negation of, in understanding that the way that our other senses of temporality are totally invalid, or and then it's a I'm not sure.
Well, I mentioned that one would have to really understand and evaluate Patočka's conception of Socrates within a kind of comparison with Strauss, with Kierkegaard, but also with Nietzsche. One of the odd things is that, again, it came out in Daniel's paper, that Patočka seems to have a very negative view of Nietzsche. He says, I reject Nietzsche's intellectualist conception of Socrates, etc., etc. But in one sense, the Nietzschean conception of the eternal recurrence, when understood in a certain kind of way, precisely as also the attempt to rethink the notion of eternity without immortality. So the eternal recurrence is precisely not that everything stays the same.
Right.
And as Deleuze championed, it's fundamentally a kind of radical principle of differentiation, which is a kind of rupturing with the space of memory and the space of habit. So again, in Deleuze, the third moment of repetition and differentiation breaks with the first moment of habit, the second moment of memory. And that is absolutely creative. It's fundamentally creative and disruptive. And that's the structure of the eternal recurrence. And that structure of the eternal recurrence is, in a sense, a kind of burden, but that burden is a kind of elevation. So there's something, I think, quite complicated that I think you can look at Nietzsche, you can look at Patočka and see that they're struggling with the same kind of problem, to rethink the centrality of the problem of eternity as the central question for subjectivity. And then in Patočka, of course, this is much more explicitly connected, as I said at the beginning, with the problem of Europe. Whereas you might say that for Nietzsche, it's the opposite. That, in a sense, to rethink something other than Europe, the eternal recurrence now becomes the central idea. Not to recuperate something which was Europe that was neutralized or suspended, if you wish, from the beginning. So that's the interesting thing, that there's a very complex relationship, of course, with Nietzsche in that regard. That there's something like the notion of the eternal recurrence in Patočka in a kind of way. And then that is a structure of repetition, of rupture. And it is a shaking in this sense that my attachment to what is, which is fundamentally what immortality is, its self-attachment for eternity in that sense, is ruptured. Because the immortality is the desire to always be, to be fundamentally self-attached, or to attach to something, to be absorbed. And that's exactly what the movement of eternity ruptures as the shaking. So that's the sense in which the eternity is the refusal of immortality. And the heroic refusal, because it's about risk and adventure.
I found very useful this reference to Gilgamesh, actually. And I remember there are other texts in which Patočka refers to Gilgamesh. I think there are still some unpublished works, also some little articles in which he wanted to recall again this problematic. If I'm not wrong, I'm not sure, in the Heretical Essays, Patočka also refers to another episode from the poem, which is the moment in which Enkidu chooses to be mortal. So not just immortality, but also the moment in which immortality is at issue. So when, I don't remember exactly the story, but when Enkidu decides to follow Gilgamesh, there is a moment in which the poem says, and in that moment Enkidu decided to become mortal. So not just be as an animal, but to reflect also on his mortality. And this reminds me also the matter, the problem of the sacrifice, actually. So this becoming mortal as an acceptance, a phenomenon of sacrifice as well. And which is not, of course, a sacrifice like sacrifice for the nation, for ideal, but is exactly what Patočka called sacrifice. So sacrifice for nothing. This is an element in Patočka's sacrifice, this meaningfulness that the real sacrifice has to have in order to be the extreme experience in which the subject can actually do what also Plato says, so take care of his death, melete thanato, this taking care of our death, meaning of our time, our timeless. And so I don't know if in your construction between this, in this passage from mortality to eternity, were actually this element of mortality. So Patočka always says that, always underlines its importance to have in mind this mortality of man. So to directly face our mortality instead of our mortification. So it is, in this case, I also remember the Czech reference is smrtelnost is mortality, and umrtvenost is this other very close. There is you can say something about that. It's a very bad translation, I think, but there are two words that both mean mortality, but in a totally different way. So smrtelnost has something to do with the mortality how we intend it. So like the thing of our existence that we have to face to be human. And umrtvenost is exactly, I think, this fall into things. So this consideration of just a positive idea of life in order to just put apart this negative and meaningless experience, which is the mere, simple and meaningless death. So I would like to see how you see this point, this mortality issue in your economy of this.
Yeah, well, I think so. In the Gilgamesh epic, first as Patočka thinks about it, and then other aspects in the epic that he himself doesn't explicitly discuss but are relevant. So, I mean, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, in a sense, represent the duality of human existence as structured by the natural order of the two movements. So that which is home and that which is strange, darkness and light, etc., etc. So wild nature and the man of the city, and they are brothers and they are friends. And the way in which Enkidu is brought from the desert to the city is actually through eros, but the eros of procreation, in the sense that he's seduced by a prostitute and they have sex. And that's what convinces Enkidu to come with Gilgamesh to the city. And precisely, that's exactly what sets off the epic, that Gilgamesh himself did not procreate, could not have sons. And the ambiguity is that Enkidu is both the brother and the son, in that sense. Okay. Then there's, of course, these two affronts to the gods, the killing of the monster and the celestial bull. And for that, because it's an affront to the gods, Enkidu must die according to the order of Enlil. And Enlil is the god who in the past is responsible for the flood. So in Patočka's thinking, it's this idea that the natural world, the mythical world, is structured always by a sense of place and home, which is always understood in duress from some threat from the outside. Then when Enkidu dies, the scene in the Gilgamesh is precisely that it is not Enkidu who comes to be aware of his own mortality, but Gilgamesh. Because Gilgamesh says, my friend Enkidu dies, it's basically Heideggerian anxiety for death, for my own death. I don't want to die. So that's the moment of, that's why it's a kind of threshold experience for Patočka. That's not fully into then the real awareness of death that then is the structure of metanoia in relationship to the good. But it's that first awareness of death which is unreflected. Now, unreflected in the Patočkian sense. It's unreflected because it's not in the context of a reflection on the good. So I do not see my death in the context of the good. So in that sense, it's unreflected. But and in a sense, it's a kind of Heideggerian. It's a critique of Heidegger because Heidegger's angst towards death is the structure of Gilgamesh. And if you look at the poem, it's exactly that. The grief, the things like that. I fear my own death, and the reaction to my own death is the quest for immortality of the gods. So you're absolutely right that for Patočka, the fullest authentic awareness of our finitude is precisely the awareness of our finitude in relationship to eternity. So there is no true awareness of death without eternity, as that which is beyond being the good, the true, etc. And I think the point that what he likes about or why he looks at Gilgamesh, though he thinks that the same point can be made by other myths, because in Plato and Europe he speaks of two other myths: the Oedipus myth and the idea of blind wandering, and then the Genesis, right, where he says, look, there's the tree of life and the tree of good and evil, but it's important that they go against the tree of good and evil because it's only by the tree of good and evil that then you can get to the tree of life, immortality. So I think the Patočkian is that it's not one or the other, but precisely the genuine sense of finitude, authenticity, is not being towards death. It's my death towards, or my death for nothing, or my death in the context of nothing. Metaphysically, nothing means that which is beyond being, that which is the good. And that, in a sense, is the anti-Heideggerian moment that then also in heretical essays, the idea that the third movement is the fracture of meaning from being, meaning that there is a source of meaning that is not in being. Because the fundamental question is not the meaning of being. The fundamental question is the meaning of the good, in terms of which there can be meaning for being. But this good itself is not being, is not positive. And that's reflected then in a certain awareness of my death. And then, as you said correctly, then a very different conception of sacrifice here.
And that's a very good explanation of this very debated topic, which is this sacrifice for nothing, yeah. In the sense, an overcoming of the being for the good.
That's right. And it also goes back to something, you said earlier, that the element of courage. Courage is a very fundamental problem, as you know, in Platonic dialogues. But why is courage so important? Precisely because it's the affirmation of something over my being. And what I affirm over my being is the good. So it's a kind of moment of rupture with attachment to things for the sake of something. And that's what courage is. So it's not, you might say that it's not courage in the face of life, which is how we think about courage today. It's courage in the face of death. You don't need courage for life. You need courage for death. If your death now becomes a confrontation to take responsibility for something higher than your own existence, which is the good. And that's a sense in which there is a kind of death of death today, as an affirmation of life.
I'm not at all familiar with Patočka, but is it possible to say that what you call the oblivion of eternity is a kind of oblivion of Seinsvergessenheit, and that eternity has the same function than Ausstrahlung oder Ereignis in relation, in the second Heidegger, in relation to Dasein from the first one?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. That's a complicated question. Well, so first, the expression oblivion of eternity is from Strauss. But I think it can be read into, so you can read it, you can see it if you wish in Patočka. So let me start with Strauss because it's his term. In Strauss, clearly, I mean, so much of Strauss is against Heidegger. And it is, in a sense, in Strauss, it's precisely to argue against the Seinsvergessenheit and the primacy of the question of being. You might say that the fundamental question is the question of the political. The political,
yeah.
For Strauss. But then in this very complex Platonic way, et cetera, et cetera. But in Patočka as well, you have this complicated argument against the Heideggerian notion of Seinsvergessenheit, because precisely, and I think you're absolutely right, that it's a kind of counter-narrative or alternative narrative to the Heideggerian narrative of the West, which is that, you know, there was an Ereignis which was never fully Ereignet, so never fully absorbed and possessed, and never fully possessed us. And this Ereignet that was never fully Ereignet then sets up a kind of structure to the history of the West, to the history of thinking, which culminates in a kind of metaphysics of power and force, which Patočka accepts. But what Patočka seems to critique and reject, and this is in the text in Heretical Essays, he's very explicit about this, is that he argues that actually there is, and here I'll use a somewhat uncharitable vocabulary because it's a bit more complex, but there is no monolithic history of being or eschatology that structures all of Europe. And why he rejects that is because he rejects the primacy of the question of being. So the argument is not that somehow the secret center of Western history is the question of being as in its forgettingness. So it's a kind of center which is outside of us, but fundamentally in us. And that then the history of the West is, in a sense, one narrative, which is this narrative of the problem of being. In Patočka, the argument is twofold. One is that, and here I'll use a technical vocabulary, that the way in which the world is a structure of manifestation towards which we as human beings are open to and can have a relationship to that world as a whole is one where the structure of that manifestation is itself not subsumed to the question of being per se. So in a sense, you might say that Patočka de-ontologizes the question of manifestation. So the fundamental problem of manifestation is not inscribed in an ontological question of being, which is how he reads what Heidegger does to Husserl. In a sense, there is no fundamental ontology as phenomenology. On the other hand, he critiques Husserl. The structure of appearance is not the appearance for a subject, which is the transcendental subject. So the kind of phenomenology and the emphasis on the problem of the manifestation of the world is not transcendental, not ontological in Patočka. It's something else. Of course, what it is, that's complicated. So that's the way in which the way in which human beings relate to what is completely historicized. So the way in which the Greeks related to what is part of a historical world that now is over, and we have no access to other than through documents and myths, etc. So that's the first way in which there is a kind of rejection of the Seinsgeschichte, and therefore it cannot center around the Vergessenheit of being. The second aspect, and you can see it's a complicated problem in Patočka, but it's actually central to understand what he means by history as a philosophical history, is that the history of the West is actually the history of three ruptures, or three wreckages, as he calls in French. I don't know what it is in Czech or in English. The wreckage.
The break.
The break. So the break, the first break is the Greek, which is a rupture. Then, we haven't talked about this at all, but Christianity is absolutely central. That's wrecked. And the third wreckage is the 20th century. So the structure of Europe is the repetition of a failed start, of a start that goes wayward. And each time trying to recuperate that beginning, and each time becoming more wayward. And then through these moments of rupture, we then glimpse something like the true meaning of authenticity and eternity, which then Patočka at the end of the 20th century wants to somehow understand. So that's why the oblivion of eternity functions structurally like Seinsvergessenheit, but then generates a very different conception of historicity than in Heidegger. So it has the same kind of structuring function, but what it structures is very different, I think. Okay, then maybe let's, well, I'll just announce it myself. Let's take a 5 minutes break.